My name's Rebecca, this is MakingLARP, and today I want to talk to you about yarn and knitting. A lot of the items that I wear in character as a LARPer are things that have been hand knitted by myself. Now in my crochet video I gave a bit of an overview over some of the types of yarn, so I want to go a little bit more in depth with that today, and also to start talking about knitting. Now I'm not going to have an instructional tutorial about how to do individual knit stitches. Frankly, the best way of doing that is short specific clips on how to do each stitch, of which there are loads available already on the internet. So I'm going to talk through some of what they look like and the different methods used to get there, but if you're looking for guides on how to do particular stitches, the best bet is to follow the links I'll put in the description to pick it up that way. Now the internet is a great resource for learning to knit. It's in fact how I taught myself, a combination of videos on the internet and books. But first I want to talk a little bit more about yarn. Now in my last video I showed you what you would get if you had a regular store-bought ball of yarn. They're generally this kind of shape, normally have a ball band around it, sometimes a little bit shorter or a little bit fatter depending on the size of yarn you get. A normal store-bought ball of yarn comes in 4 particular sizes. You either get it 50 gram ball, 100 gram ball, or in the case of like chunky or an Aran, you might be able to pick up a 500 gram ball. On the ball band for each yarn will generally be a rough length as a guide, either in meters or yards, and any knitting or crochet pattern you pick up will generally have how many meters or yards the project will take on a normal weight of yarn. Obviously a 50 gram ball of a very thin lace weight yarn is going to have a lot longer length than a 50 gram ball of a very thick chunky yarn. What you'll find if you are getting into more independent dyed yarn, whether that's doing it yourself as I've done here or buying from independent sellers online, is that they'll generally sell their yarn by the skein. The skein is this thing here. It's a long length of the yarn. Every maker is going to go slightly different. I've got a little marker on here, so I aim for a 60 centimetre diameter of my skein. This item here is called a swift or a yarn swift. Generally there are 2 types of swifts available. This is an umbrella style, as I'll show you now. It folds down and then you can take your yarn over and around. Generally you'll either see yarn that's sold in skeins like this, or you will see them like this, where it's been twisted a little bit. If you are going to be working with skeins of yarn, please do try and keep them twisted up like this for as long as possible. Basically, unless you're in the process of winding it onto a ball, you want to keep it like this so it doesn't end up a tangled mess. What happens if you don't do that? This happens if you don't do that. When it comes to winding a ball from a skein of yarn, which is how most people that are knitting or crocheting will turn their yarn into a usable form, you can either just take one end and wind it into a ball like so, or use a mechanical ball winder, which generally is something that will clip onto a desk, much as I've clipped the winder onto here. And you would take your skein, untwist it, put it round, make it out into the size that you need, and obviously attach everything. If you don't have a skein winder, the traditional methods is to find a partner willing to hold their arms out for ages, or use the back of a chair or a couple of chairs. Basically you wanted to keep the tension of the yarn so that it doesn't get itself tangled. But a mechanical ball winder is normally something that will clamp onto a desk you will hook one end of the yarn through and it'll have a little crank and it'll slowly wind into a ball for you. Sometimes people refer to the balls made from that process as yarn cakes, as they tend to be kind of flat rather than round like this style of ball I showed you before. If you're doing it by hand, there are also tools called nostipines. I'm assuming I pronounced it right, I've only ever seen it written down, which are basically like a wooden rod that you would wrap the yarn through. The point of using a nostipine or a ball winder is it gives you the option to use what's called a centre ball ball. Most commercial balls, as I showed you, will roughly work like that. You might have to dig into the ball of yarn a little bit to find the other end. But obviously a length of yarn has two ends, and a lot of people find it more convenient to use the yarn that's from the end that's in the inside if they've got access to it, because it means as they're going the ball of yarn is going to stay in one place rather than rolling all around away from them. It's also useful if you're trying to do a project two at a time, as that means you can use both ends at once. Now we've gone over yarn a bit, I want to start talking about knitting. As I've said, links to all of the different individual stitches and how to do them will be in the description. There are a few specific terms that you will need to know when looking at a knitting pattern. And a lot of times in knitting patterns, descriptions and instructions will be given in the form of abbreviations. So the first one is casting on. This will also be written as CO. They might give additional details if you need to use a particular type of cast on. Again, there are quite a few different methods. So your first instruction on most pattern is going to be CO and then a number, which will be the number of stitches you want to cast on. For most patterns this won't count as your first row if you're being told to do something every so many rows. When you're being told to cast on your project, it might specify what type of needle you need to cast on. As well as being a sized needle, for example, this is a much bigger needle than this. And the project you're going to do with one will turn out vastly different if you follow instructions meant for one needle with the other. Both these needles are classed as straight needles. Most knitting projects, unless they are vintage projects, will have the needle size listed in one of two ways. Either they will have the American size, or they will have a millimetre size. As labelled here, these are 20mm needles and they are 40 centimetres in length. This is an old British knitting needle and it's labelled as a size 12. Most yarn stores will be able to sell you some sort of measuring equipment, and there are apps out there that will allow you to size your needle up against various rows so you can actually measure how many millimetres thick it is if you don't have some sort of converter. The only thing to keep in mind if you are looking at vintage patterns is the British and American size guides for needles work opposite ways, and I'm probably going to get it wrong. I'm pretty sure this is a British needle. I know that they are the same size at size 7, but I believe that in British needles you get a smaller number as the needle gets bigger, whereas in American needles you get a smaller number as the needles get smaller. But most modern British shops will sell them with a millimetre size. Straight needles are great for projects where you're going to go backwards and forwards, like scarves, or projects that are done in pieces. So by this I mean to say a t-shirt where you have sleeves, a front and a back piece, and then you're going to sew them together at the end. So by doing it all on straight needles you can work on one little bit of it at the time, and you go backwards and forwards on your needle, working right side of your pattern, which will often be labelled as RS, and wrong side of your pattern, the alternate row, normally labelled as WS. If you are looking at a project that is in the round, most notably socks, or occasionally the sleeves of a project, you might want to use double pointed needles, which might be listed on your pattern as DPNs. This is a 10-metre DPN. You can see it's got a point on both ends, hence the name. You would use these as a group, and your yarn would be split around in such a way that it forms a circle. So you would either use 3 and a spare, or 4 and a spare, that's your working needle, and you would work across one needle, which point all its stitches would move to your working needle. Oops. Then across the next needle, then across the next needle, round and round and round. For ease of keeping track at the start of your round, there are tools called stitch markers. They're available in a few different types. I make my own, and I'm soon going to start selling them over at folksy.com. If you are interested at all in buying stitch markers or in hand dyed yarn. And these basically form a loop that you would put somewhere on your pattern, and then as you're knitting you've got a nice marker, so when you come around that stitch you know either that's the beginning of the round, or you might have a pattern with lace work in it where you want to keep where your increases, decreases, whatever part of the pattern is notified. Most places I've seen, especially indie supply shops, you're able to get them in either individual markers or usually sets of around 5 or 6. I personally prefer 5 because in a lace pattern you've probably got paired things, so I generally do them in like 4 of one type and 1 of another. But these are generally used for small circular projects where you are doing something that's relatively thin. Most notably socks are mostly worked by people on DPNs, or if they're using longer circular needles. And this is a circular needle here, as you can see it's got 2 kind of normal needle bits and a long piece of plastic wire in the middle. So you would use it as a circle like that, knitting. So you tend to find 2 main uses for this. One, if people are doing a really long project, they use it as straight needles going backwards and then forwards, but it's able to hold more stitches than a regular straight needle. Or in bigger circular projects, for example, if you're doing a jumper with no seams or a skirt or something along that lines, you'll see people using circular needles. And again, people might use a stitch marker to mark the beginning of the round, but you can just as easily, if you're completely new, use a scrap of yarn tied in a loop and tightened up around the stitch marker. You don't have to rush out and buy fancy ones, so of course I would love for people to buy mine. If you are using circular needles, or you find that you flip between projects, the next step after a regular circular needle is an interchangeable. These are normally available as sets and I don't seem to have a cord for it at the moment, but you will have a cord that has a screw on the end and it screws into the end of your needles. So it does mean if you have particularly weird gauge, or perhaps you were doing a project where instead of adding stitches you just go up a needle size, you can just switch the needle out and work from it from there. Especially useful if you're doing top half projects for ladies, because obviously you need a bit more room on the bust area, and then you want to go back to a smaller needle neck up. And again, depending on the length of the cord is going to depend whether you are going to be using that for big circular projects or little items like socks. Both on interchangeable and regular circular needle, you can get a wide length of the cord part, so depending on what you're wanting to use it for. In my case I have expanders, so I can add lots of cord together to make a really long one, and I have stoppers, so if I want to stop a project or take, say, the stitches for the sleeves off of it, I can put them on a separate cord and add them back in later when I finish doing the armhole. Now we've talked a little bit about equipment, I want to talk to you about the types of stitch. Realistically, in knitting, there are actually only 5 stitches. You have knitting, which is what the majority of this hat is in. And you have purl, which is the stitches at the back. As you can see, the kind of bumpy stitches there. Now this is a colour work piece, which means I use 2 different yarns at once. So say this section is just the yarns being carried over, but the section at the top, those are all purl stitches you can see at the back. When you knit a piece, you are essentially telling it whether it should be knit or purl at the front. So if you're doing a knit stitch, the back of it will be a purl. So if it's a piece with a right side and wrong side, you knit on the front side, it'll be a purl at the back. If you purl on the front side, it'll be a knit on the back. If you alternate those stitches within a row, that's referred to as ribbing. So lots of things like cuffs, the tops of socks, some scarves are all done with ribbing. Generally, if a pattern tells you to do a rib, it says rib and then number by number. So it'll be like 1x1 is a 1 by 1 rib, this is a 2 by 2 rib. It just means you're doing 2 of one stitch, then 2 of the other and repeating. Sometimes in knitting pattern, if you were doing the same thing for a long period of time, so it'll tell you to do a certain stitch and then for X number of rows or for how many inches. The basic stitches that everyone is expected to know are stockinette and garter. Stockinette is this here, so all of the stitches at the front are knit stitches. So you would knit every row that is a right-sided row, or if you're on a circle where you don't have a back-sided row because you're going round and round rather than backwards and forwards, you would knit every row. If a pattern tells you to do reverse stockinette, it means that you are doing the opposite. So if it's a pattern that is on straight needles, you are doing the purl stitches on the right side of the work and the knit stitches on the wrong side of the work. If it's a circular project, you're purling every row. Garter stitch is where you knit every row on a project that is on straight needles. I suppose you could do garter stitch on circular needles, but you would basically knit one row and then purl the other, and that would give you the same effect. And you can tell a garter stitch project because it looks like loads of little ridges. This is an effect of the purl stitches, as the purl stitches tend to stick out more when the knit stitches lie flat. So a really good basic project is a garter stitch scarf, as you can just cast on how many stitches you want and then just knit backwards and forwards as long as you want, and you'll end up with a relatively nice looking scarf. Now I've talked about the main 2 stitches in knitting, which are knitting and purling, and the cast on, which is a kind of separate stitch in itself. From there you've got 3 other main things that you'll use. Use these for shaping and also if you're doing lace work. The first is an increase, and again, go to the videos for more details, as there are lots of different methods of increasing and they will add stitches that look certain ways, that lean one way over the other. Generally a knitting pattern where it's important will tell you which increase to use, and if you stick the abbreviated term, if they haven't given you the long version, into Google with the word knitting, and you'll find an instruction video or picture display of how to do it. The same goes for decreasing, so whether you increase or decrease to make shapes or for certain patterns. For example, a sock will generally have decreases if it's a knee sock because your calf is bigger at this end than it is by the time it gets to your ankle. That sort of thing. Certain increases and decreases leave a hole in your work, just with the way the stitches lie. This is what becomes the basis for lace work. In lace work, the main 2 techniques that you're using are increases, decreases and yarn overs. Yarn over is very simply where you take the yarn and then before you do the next stitch, you wrap it round the needle once. Unless the yarn over specifically says to wrap it more than once, that's literally all you do, and then you move on to the next stitch. So what you'll find in a lot of lace pattern is you'll do a yarn over, and if it's say a triangle shawl where you might only start with 2 or 3 stitches, and then every time you do one of these yarn overs you're adding stitches, that will form the shape. Or if it's a straight piece of work, when you go back to work those stitches on the next row, you will decrease them into a stitch, which then gives you the hole for your lace work. The other main stitch you will use is a slip stitch. Slipping yarn in knitting is different than slipping yarn in crochet. When you do a slip stitch in crochet, it just means that it's a very small stitch. In knitting, you are literally just taking the stitches from one needle and slipping them across the other without putting the yarn through it. So, as you can see from this piece here, with the yarn over top, generally if you are doing a slip stitch, you'll be told, and it's probably abbreviated, but it'll either say with yarn in front, which is in yarn in front of your needle, or with yarn in back. So again, this will be on a piece where you have a right side and a wrong side. If you slip yarn in front of your work on the right side, this is what will happen. The yarn will carry over across and you will see there's a line. In some pieces that will look really good, in others you'll want to hide that. So this is slip stitches are the basis of this pattern. It's worth pointing out as well that the sequins on this item are actually in the yarn itself. They're not something I've added. So you can get all sorts of interesting yarns with different things in them, or you can add beads to project yourself. Now there are a couple of different methods of doing this, but personally the method I find the best, whilst it can cause issues if you're using very fine yarn, just thread all of the beads onto your yarn before you start and then you work them. You can add beads, sequins, whatever else into your yarn after the fact, but that's a more advanced technique which I'll go into a later stage. One other major term that you might need explained to you is I-cord. Sometimes projects will ask you to use I-cord for things like loops or toggles, or to tie off a project with, or to make as a belt. I-cord is normally knitted on DP ends and is done by, say, having 3 stitches. You knit those 3 stitches and then instead of turning your work, you would bring your yarn back to the beginning and knit those 3 stitches again, forming a chain. Now personally, I hate doing this, and a really good and almost identical looking solution is to use a French knitting tool. I'm not going to show you how to use this right now. I'm assuming most of you have done French knitting at school. If not, again, there are great instructional videos on the internet and it'll be much easier for you to pick up that technique by watching a 4-second video over and over again than trying to cut down this video to find the one little bit you need. But if you're willing to spend the extra money and you really don't want to learn how to do it yourself, you can get tools which allow you to make I-cord mechanically. They have the instructions in there, and basically you feed the yarn through, follow the instructions, and you can just turn a handle and it'll crank out I-cord for you. So this is generally how I do it if I ever use it in projects. Well, I think that's as much as I can give you an overview without actually showing you any knitting. So I hope this has inspired you to have a little look into projects. Knitting is great as a way of making items for LARP because it's a fun hobby. It's one that I see appropriate for almost all settings, ranging from the medieval fantasy to anything up to about 1960s, before it even became remotely uncool or something that housewives stopped doing. And even then, it's always a tradition that's stayed on. It's something you can sit and do in character, especially at the longer events where there might be lulls in action. So it's something you can do in and out of character, and you get a cool, cosy, warm item at the end of it, which again, if you're doing events that are going to be cold, is really great. And the availability of different yarns and stuff makes it really good for doing stuff that's going to be unique to your character without shelling out loads of money, other than the initial cost of your needles if you don't have them already, and the cost of the yarn itself. Thank you for watching. Take care.